So welcome everybody to our first webinar from the Industry Speakers Series. Today we are having Dr. Richard Ehrhardt from Michigan State University. He will talk to us about nutritional management of ewes in late pregnancy to prevent a metabolic disease. His presentation will include a 1-hour presentation, and at the end we'll have a 30-minute period where you will have the time to ask your questions. So just to talk to you more about the Industry Speaker Series, it's 10 webinars that will take place through 2021 and 2022. Our objective through those 10 webinars is to improve sheep knowledge and to get to know what is done internationally in various fields related to sheep production. So this project was funded by a Canadian agricultural partnership, an agreement between the government of Canada and Quebec from Innovation Agri-Food Program. So my name is Stéphanie Dion. I will be your host this morning. I'm a new project manager at the CEPOQ, but my colleague Marie-Josée and Catherine are also with me this morning if we need any help. So this sums it up for me. Richard, I would be ready to I should say give you the floor or give you the screen in this pandemic era. So thank you for joining us this morning. You can take the control and I'll stop my camera and my mic. So thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. I appreciate this invitation to speak to your group. It's an exciting opportunity for me. I've learned a lot from producers in Quebec about, especially about accelerated production. And so I hold your knowledge in high esteem. And yeah, I'd like to share with you a talk here on nutritional management of the type of sheep that we typically use in these production systems. These are sheep that are typically very prolific, and they are prone to some metabolic problems because they're so efficient, so productive, unless we manage them properly. So with that, let me, as an overview, I'm going to talk about basically the requirements of these sheep in different terms, both in terms of their energetic needs and their needs for protein. So I'm going to set that as kind of the initial stage. And then I'm going to get a little more specific and talk about some of the particular metabolic adaptations that sheep need to take to be able to stay healthy through late pregnancy, particularly given the huge drain of nutrients that the fetus and the placental tissues pull on a ewe, especially when they're bearing large litters of lambs. So we need to consider those to prevent conditions like ketosis, or what might be more commonly called pregnancy toxemia to some. So as a general overview, when we think about nutritional management of sheep in relation to pregnancy, I like to divide it into these general areas as management programs. One would be this pre-breeding period, which is that period just before breeding, which you can make a big impact on ovulation rate of sheep by improving their energy intake in particular. Then we have early pregnancy, which is also a distinct window. Mid-pregnancy, which is a period of placental growth. So if you think about pregnancy, maybe a proper way to do that would be to divide it into 3 chapters: early, mid, and late pregnancy of roughly equal length. So mid-pregnancy is this period of placental growth. The fetus is certainly growing, but that's when the sheep placenta has this explosive growth pattern. Late pregnancy becomes very important because from a quantitative sense, that's when most of fetal growth occurs and important developmental changes occur. And then for the mother, for the ewe, there's important aspects of her nutrition in relation to colostrum production and development even of the mammary gland. So those are things we need to think about. So if we think about this pre-breeding period, we often refer to it in sheep production as flushing, which is kind of a funny word, but it really is just to improve the energy status of the sheep to improve its ovulation rate. And what we know is that both short-term and longer-term nutrition play a role in determining this. By increasing the energy plane intake for just even a week can improve ovulation rate. What we found in our experiments, and it doesn't matter which season you're talking about, if you're breeding sheep year-round like you do in Quebec or we do in our production system, we see a big impact of improved energy nutrition. If we increase their energy intake for 2 to 3 weeks, about 2 times or double their maintenance requirement. Now, again, their maintenance requirement of a sheep is the amount of energy it takes to maintain their body weight. So if we effectively double that, we get this big impact. If we only feed them to maybe 1.5 times, we don't see nearly as dramatic of an impact. So it does require a fairly big change in energy nutrition, particularly in prolific sheep, to see this. And it's a dramatic impact. It's a good investment. We see increases of 25, 30% compared to not doing this, which is a really sound investment if you consider the cost of this nutrition versus the return in lambs born. Okay. Generally, this is done by improving the energy density of the diet. So that means probably feeding some grain. Although it is possible to achieve some of this energy intake with really good pasture, more commonly, it's easier to do that with some grain supplementation. So ewes will respond well if they're not already in very good body condition. So if they have a high body condition, they're above a score of 3.5, they're sort of fat, they're not going to respond very well. Okay. So here's just a picture I have of some sheep eating some high quality forage. It's possible to flush on a program like this. If you're in a more confinement production system, you can certainly do this more precisely with controlled nutrition, increasing the energy density of the diet. So in early pregnancy, this first trimester, first third, is this period of implantation where the embryo implants and the placenta, which is an important organ, critical organ, of course, is established, and that's often called placentation. So this occurs most effectively when the sheep, the ewe, isn't losing weight. It's also becoming more clear that we don't want the sheep to be overfed and fat. So excessive caloric intake seems also to be sort of a negative. So we want them right about at maintenance, maybe slightly positive weight gain. So what we do is we would like to scale down this nutritional program so that they're not right about the time you put rams in. And that'll improve implantation and embryo survival. And another reason why we don't want to continue to feed these sheep at 2 times maintenance, this high energy intake, is because they'll get pretty fat. And that can have negative consequences for late pregnancy in terms of ketosis, which I'll talk about later. So in mid-pregnancy, again, this is this period of rapid expansion of the sheep placenta. Interestingly, this is kind of a developmental program that's not controlled by nutrition so much. So if the animals are even in a semi-starvation state, their placentas grow pretty well. So nutrition doesn't impact placental growth very much once it's established. However, high temperatures will impact placental development. Now, this might not be a problem in the northern United States or in your part of Canada, but we do see it in countries where we have high heat, high humidity. Lambs will be small, stunted, and it's because the placental growth is impaired. So placental size does determine fetal size. So the absolute size of the placenta, as I'll show you in a minute, if you can manipulate the size, which you can really only do experimentally, you'll see that you'll get a corresponding change in fetal size. And the other interesting point, which you may or may not know, is that the size of the placental, the aggregate mass of the placenta. So if there's, triplets, you'll have more placental mass. If you have a very large lamb compared to a very small lamb, it has a bigger placenta. That determines to a large degree the extent of mammary development for that particular pregnancy. So it's those placental hormones that dictate milk production for the ensuing lactation. And you think about it, this is a pretty smart strategy that Mother Nature has put together, because this is Mother Nature's way then of matching the offspring needs to milk supply. So that's important to get. And as it were, you can underfeed ewes to a modest degree. And in some production, not that you purposefully are looking to underfeed ewes, but in your production system, you may find it more efficient, for example, to graze sheep during this period on maybe lower quality pasture. And that can be a good use of your resources, because if they lose a little weight during this period, it generally has very little consequence for their pregnancy status. So here's just a picture of a sheep fetus actually separated from the maternal environment. So this would be what some people would call a cotyledon, which attaches to a caruncle. The caruncle is the maternal tissue in the uterus. It's a discrete attachment point in the uterus that this fetal tissue associates with and informs this placenta. So the sheep placenta, as you are aware, has composed of many discrete units called placentomes. There might be there's a variable number depending on the number of fetuses that are present, but there's quite a few. There might be only 20 placentomes for example, a ewe that's for a quadruplet fetus, versus a singleton might have 120. So they're pretty big differences. And that has a large impact on its growth and size. So I can show this here with this graph, where we look at a number of different models where we've tried to independently alter placental size, as shown here, and then look at its impact on fetal weight. So this is done with something called Chironcolectomy, which Stephanie was asking me about earlier, which is just an experimental procedure you would do only, as a scientist to look at this concept. Basically, you remove caruncles from the pregnant uterus, so you'll limit the size of the placenta. So if you remove a bunch of caruncles, you get smaller placenta and smaller lambs. If you heat treat some ewes and compare them to ones that were in normal temperature, you do the same thing. You get small placentas, smaller fetuses. If you don't heat them, you get larger placentas and larger fetuses. Prolific sheep the same way. Here we have a bunch of singletons up here with large placentas, large fetal mass. And here we have some quads and triplets with small placentas and small fetal mass. Finally, another way that you can manipulate placental size, which is kind of interesting, is if you overfeed a very young ewe, you tend to get smaller placentas, which is kind of a unique phenomenon. The whole point here is that regardless of how you do this, you get this correspondingly very similar response in fetal weight when you alter placental size. If you alter placental size, you get a change in fetal weight. So this is a pretty tight relationship, really. So that size of the placenta sets that growth trajectory for the fetus. So if it's got a small placenta here, as you see here, the placenta seems to lose a little weight. It doesn't actually lose mass, it just loses water content. So don't get too confused by that. But when they're a triplet, they have a small placenta, their growth rate is much slower, as you can see. Whereas if they're a singleton and they have a larger placenta, use a different pointer here, you see that they have a correspondingly greater growth rate. And there's less of a change in growth in late pregnancy. You see this diminishment of growth happen pretty predictably with triplets. So to meet their requirements, we can meet their requirements with a maintenance type forage diet. They don't need concentrate. In fact, they can lose a little weight, as I said, maybe that not necessarily is a strategy. We want to make sure though that they get adequate mineral nutrition. You don't want to short them on minerals, obviously. And yes, if the sheep are pretty thin, you do need to maybe do some supplemental feeding then. So here's just a picture of sheep I used to raise. Grazing. These sheep are in mid-pregnancy. They're digging through the snow. There's pasture underneath the snow. This is a time where you can utilize resources like this. However, in late pregnancy, things change. The ewe is going to prioritize her own, or not her tissues, actually. The fetus gets the priority. That's the interesting part. And she will lose weight if she's not adequately fed. She'll get low body condition. She won't produce as much milk, which is a big problem, especially if she's, going to have triplets or a large number of lambs. And this problem can lead to ketosis, as I'll talk about later. And you'll get smaller lambs because typically, the mother can do amazing things to maintain fetal weight, but at a certain point, the lambs will become smaller. So we need to supplement these animals to maintain this demand and to meet this demand. And this equates to, according to the nutrient requirement tables, and I believe in them, about 2 times, again, for maintenance, about double the nutrition of maintenance, 200%. And then for triplets, about 2.3%, 2.3 times. Ewes carrying a singleton have far lower requirements, so the group feeding strategies might make some sense if you do ultrasound in your sheep and you know the fetal number. It could save you some money and reallocate your resources effectively. In the United States, we don't have too many people do that because it's hard to count fetuses accurately, but it is something to consider. So again, just summarize the same information. These are energy. This is energy nutrition now. So they need 1.5, 2, or 2.3 times maintenance during this last period of development. But of course, the challenge is how do we give this greater energy amount when we have constraints in intake? So this ewe, as you know, can look pretty big, right? I mean, from a very physical point of view, that's a large pregnant uterus. It might be constricting gastrointestinal intake. Also, metabolically, these sheep can have some inhibition of intake for factors that are less obvious, but just the physical limitation can be significant. So we need to increase the energy density of this diet, but we need to do this in a smart way so that they maintain their intake. If we just suddenly change their diet and give them a lot of high energy feeds, a lot of starch, a lot of corn, it could, cause some problems metabolically. It could shut their intake down and cause worse problems. So what we want to do is target a diet that has a certain fiber level. In this case, I didn't really introduce this very well here, but this term here is called neutral detergent fiber, or the acronym is NDF. That's a measure of dietary fiber, the plant cell wall material. We want to keep that in our diet less than 40%. In fact, we want to have it a little closer to 30%. But the caveat here is that not all NDF is the same. So if we have more digestible fiber in the diet, we could have a little more fiber because it's greater digestibility, greater energy content. So we want to maximize the use of highly digestible fiber sources, which are high quality forages. And we want to target an intake of these ewes of about 3% of their body weight. Now, if they achieve 3% of their body weight, generally they're going to be able to consume sufficient energy. When it drops down into the low 2% range, it leads to problems. We need to limit our use of starch feeds, although we need to add some corn and some concentrates. If we add too much, we can inhibit intake a little bit. So here's just some of these energy and protein density targets that I would recommend for ewes according to their number of lambs that they're carrying, okay? So we need high energy content with triplet bearing ewes, modest energy content with singles, and the crude protein set accordingly. I'll talk about crude protein in just a minute and touch on that in greater detail. And of course, we're going to need to alter our feeding a little bit based on our production system, perhaps. If we're in an accelerated production system, we might feed just a little differently than if we're doing once per year production. Because with accelerated production, of course, those ewes need to become pregnant immediately after they wean lambs, right? So that's a little different program. So what's the best way to increase this density in a safe and effective manner? Well, using higher digestibility forages is key. So this could be in terms of quality pasture, like I'm showing you in the picture behind me, or with stored forage sources that are, a little higher in quality, a little higher digestibility. We are probably going to need to supplement this diet with some concentrates, right? In our case, where we live, and probably for you, corn makes a bit of sense since it's available. Although maybe in more northern areas, barley is a really good choice as well. It's an effective energy supplement, but we have to be careful that we monitor the starch content of these diets. And there might be cases to be made where we want to include some other forms of high energy feeds that aren't so high in starch. For example, if your forage quality is limited, like you just can't get these quality forages that are needed, you could consider some byproduct feeds. In the United States, we have a large soybean industry. We grow a lot of soybeans. So we get a byproduct feed called soy hulls here, which are excellent nutritional quality. They're high fiber, but interestingly, they're very high in energy. So it's kind of like a high quality forage, and we can buy these fairly cheaply. So these fit our diet program. So we'll include soy hulls in our diets because they're high energy, high fiber. Wheat middlings are another byproduct of the wheat milling industry that we have available. I'm not sure about the availability of some of these in Canada, but I'm just giving some examples of some byproduct feeds. And the key characteristics here are that they're high in fiber, yet the fiber's highly digestible, therefore high energy for the animal. So they're like a high quality forage. Okay. So when we think about forage quality, just to discuss that for a minute, we're talking again, just to review that, of the cell wall component. Here we have a plant cell wall. You wonder, why do I show a plant cell wall in a sheep talk? Well, it's important for the nutrition of the animal to understand that the digestibility of these cell wall constituents are key in determining the intake of the animal and the quality. And these cell wall constituents, the cellulose, the hemicellulose, and the lignin, vary in digestibility quite a bit. As you might be aware, lignin is a highly indigestible source. When you have plants that are overly mature, not harvested perhaps at the optimal state for quality, they're going to have a high lignin content, and this is largely an indigestible dietary component. Cellulose varies quite a bit, as is hemicellulose in its digestibility. Not all cellulose is terrible. So that's important to understand. So understanding the digestibility of our forages becomes important. And you can predict the digestibility reasonably well by certain factors. And these would include the vegetative, the plant maturity. So forages obviously are harvested earlier in their growth pattern. They're going to have less lignin. They might have a fair bit of fiber, but that fiber is going to be nicely digestible. The growing temperature makes an impact as well to a lesser degree. If it's really hot, you tend to have higher, less digestible fiber. And then the type of plant species that you're looking at is going to dictate digestibility as well. For example, grass forages, if they're cool season grasses, which are the C3 photosynthetic pathway, that probably mostly what you have in Quebec and we have in Michigan, versus warm season grasses. Corn's actually a warm season grass, but it happens to be highly digestible. That tends to be lower in general, though. Corn might be an exception. Legumes are different than grasses as well. So, ways you manage digestibility, well, it can be very simple at the farm, just making sure that we manage our grazing so that we have, turning the animals in to high quality forage and managing our rotations so we keep them in this vegetative state becomes important. Harvesting at the correct time, making sure that our forages are not overly mature. In Quebec, I'm sure it's the same here, and probably maybe even more so. For most of us, we cannot capture high quality forage unless we use a silage system because we just don't have enough warm days to harvest at that optimal maturity state. So this probably means a silage system for you, and that's an excellent way to capture quality. Okay. So I'm going to just get back to that protein question, which I mentioned earlier, and give you a little bit of background here on the protein requirements of pregnant ewes. I was involved in a study quite a few years ago now at Cornell University where we sought to sort of validate or understand what the protein requirements of late pregnancy are for sheep. We actually did this work as a way to understand dairy cow requirements, but it has a lot of value to understand for sheep for sure. So what we did here, I'll try to set this up. We measured protein, and I'm showing here nitrogen, which is a measurement of protein. So you could just simply replace the word protein for nitrogen here, and you would be in perfectly good understanding. So what we did is we fed these animals just during late pregnancy, and these were twin pregnant ewes. So they're prolific sheep. During the last 30 days of pregnancy, we fed them either a low protein diet, 8% crude protein, a medium protein diet, around 11.5% crude protein, or a high protein diet, around 16% crude protein. We gave them a similar amount of energy. So the energy intake was pretty well balanced. So their energy status was similar, but we sought simply to change their protein intake. And what we did is we sacrificed these animals in late pregnancy, and we looked at the tissue contents of protein and how they changed over that time. So the way we measured the changes, we also had one group that we sacrificed around just at the beginning of this stage as our baseline group, just to make that more clear. So what we found is in the pregnant uterus, we didn't see a big change in protein content of the pregnant uterus. When they were underfed, the lambs were slightly smaller, not that dramatically different. And there wasn't a clear difference between fetal growth in the high protein or medium protein group. By the way, this level of protein is essentially what the NRC, our National Research Council requirements suggest for late pregnancy for twin pregnant ewes. So that's kind of why we chose that as our standard. But we found when we measured the protein content of maternal tissues, we saw that the low protein diets, the animals lost a lot of protein. So these animals were able to partition protein from their tissues into the fetal compartment pretty effectively. Okay. But more interestingly, what we found is when we looked at this at a finer point, we looked at these maternal tissues specifically, and we saw some pretty big differences in how they mobilize protein. What we found is that even in this supposedly requirement level of 11.5%, these animals still lost a fair bit of protein from their skeletal muscle. So when we looked at the protein content of skeletal muscle, it was certainly lower. And low proteins, of course, were much more. And what we found is the high protein diet, we were able to get them to actually gain protein in their skeletal muscle. So that's a pretty big difference between this and here. So it kind of begs the question is, what should the protein level be? This level of protein maintained fetal growth, but it also caused loss of protein from muscle. Why might that be important? Well, I can only really speculate, but I think it could be important for things like milk production. When you think about it, when ewes aren't, a ewe raising triplets is not going to consume enough protein or energy in her diet to meet milk needs in that early stage of lactation. She's going to need some protein reserve, some source. So likely that skeletal muscle is a huge reserve for that. So perhaps in these more prolific sheep, we need to think about feeding them a little more protein, maybe something 13 or 14% right in the middle. And that's usually what I recommend so that we don't have this protein loss and maybe we enhance milk production. That remains unproven. So let me summarize that. So fetal growth is optimized at these protein planes, but supplementing protein above this might improve maternal muscle retention, as we showed, and that may have some implications for milk production. It could increase milk production, perhaps. And then, of course, we always want to consider whether that supplemental increase would be cost effective. Is this a reasonable strategy? So I'd be a little conservative in suggesting whole big changes in that, but it does suggest that the protein requirements, are, I think, better defined now from that study, at least. Okay, so I'm going to now shift my focus just a little bit and talk more about metabolic problems. So I gave you kind of the normal picture. I gave you hopefully an understanding of the major chapters of pregnancy and their nutrient requirements, a little bit about energy and protein nutrition. Now we're going to talk about problems that can happen when these maternal adaptations fail. So I'm going to talk about maternal adaptations. So if the ewe doesn't consume enough energy in late pregnancy, we can have problems because there's a huge demand of a specific nutrient, glucose, that the fetus has. The fetus essentially operates on glucose, and that can create problems for the ewe when she can't produce enough. And that can produce a problem called ketosis. So glucose, again, is this limiting nutrient for fetal growth. Amino acids are also, of course, important, but important to understand that the fetal compartment doesn't use fat. So fat doesn't really transport across the placenta in any quantitative significance. So that fetus is living on glucose, okay? On the other hand, the mother can use fat as her energy to meet her needs. So that's important to understand. And when her energy supply is limiting, she'll mobilize fat, meet her tissue requirements, and maintain glucose delivery to the fetus, so it maintains its growth and development. However, fetal glucose supply is going to have a big impact on maternal energy use, whether she runs on fat or not. And within the fetal compartment, it has an impact on, like if the lamb's a little short on glucose, it has to use amino acids for energy. So if it uses amino acids for energy, it's going to have less amino acids available for growth, and its growth is going to slow down. It's going to be smaller. It's going to be growth retarded. So this prioritization of the placenta and fetus for nutrients in blood has been known for many, many years. Probably one of the earlier people to articulate this was John Hammond, who's actually knighted for his work in this area. So he's a sir in the early 40s. He did a lot of interesting work. And he's just showing by the number of these arrows, the relative prioritization of different tissues for nutrients in the blood. So basically, the placenta and fetus are almost at the same prioritization as the brain and central nervous system of the ewe. So here's maternal tissues, here's fetal tissues. This kind of means that the fetus and placenta are almost a parasite. Some people would describe them that way because they have such high prioritization. And that's important to understand when we think about maternal adaptations. So the way the mother has to adapt to meet fetal requirements is what she does. And this is a little more technical, but I'll do my best to describe it. She develops what is called insulin resistance in some of her tissues. So basically her tissues become less dependent on glucose and more dependent on fat, because this molecule insulin, which regulates glucose disposal, the response of these tissues changes. So these tissues, particularly muscle and fat, become less responsive. So that gives more glucose available to the placenta and fetus. So it diverts glucose to this. And so this is done experimentally. We've shown this. I was involved in some studies early in my career where we demonstrated this pretty effectively. What I'm showing here is if we compare non-pregnant sheep to pregnant sheep, or sheep that are in late pregnancy, and we look at the ability of insulin to dispose of glucose. So we change the amount of insulin that we give to these animals. We see that their utilization and their peripheral tissues and their muscle is much less. So they're less responsive. So a ewe in late pregnancy, you give her a bunch of insulin, her skeletal muscle won't use as much because it's putting more of that glucose to the pregnant uterus. So that's a normal metabolic adaptation that occurs. If you undernourish these ewes on top of that, you see a greater adaptation. They become even less responsive to insulin. So a ewe that's underfed here to 60% of her requirements, that's a pretty good amount of undernutrition. She'll actually still be able to meet glucose needs of the fetus at that level, but she does it by using less glucose in her tissues. And the way that happens is mostly because of insulin responsiveness changes. So insulin just isn't nearly as effective in pushing glucose into tissues as it was when they're well fed. So if we look at this, we look at the glucose economy of the late pregnant ewe, and that's what we're looking at here. Here's a number of studies that our group at Cornell did. Alan Bell was our principal investigator in the lab, and he's well known for this sort of work, and I was involved in some of it over the years. What we did is we looked at animals that are well fed, animals that are moderately underfed, and animals that are more severely underfed during late pregnancy. And what we looked at here is the glucose utilization of these tissues. So this was measured by means that are a little complicated. We use actually radioisotopes to measure this. So it's pretty involved methodology. But what we were able to show is that if animals are moderately underfed, yes, there's less total glucose used by the ewe, but the amount that goes to the fetus and placenta, shown here in pink, is the same. So essentially, she's able to repartition nutrients from her needs to the fetus, okay? So this is a normal metabolic adaptation that occurs if the ewes are moderately underfed. However, if they're more severely underfed to 35%, which is a pretty severe underfeeding. I've seen this in the field, but it's pretty severe. At that case, she's not able to compensate because her tissues have a requirement. It's a little bit less, but the fetus becomes growth retarded in this case. In this case, it doesn't. Basically, this ewe is becoming very thin, but her lambs are the same size. In this case, where it's more severe, both she's very thin and her lambs are small. Okay. So what happens with pregnancy toxemia is like this type of adaptation that I'm describing does occur, but it becomes not as effective, I guess would be the right word. So this low circulating glucose, what it does that I've described that will happen when they're underfed is it'll trigger that ewe to mobilize a lot of adipose tissue. She'll mobilize lots of fat. What happens is that capacity of the liver to convert fat to energy becomes saturated. So instead of the liver being able to produce glucose, because in a sheep, the liver is what produces glucose, most of the glucose that a sheep produces does not come from its diet directly. It comes from production from the liver. So the liver has to produce glucose. But if the liver is sort of damaged by all this fat entering at once, it can't produce glucose, and that becomes a big problem. So instead of producing glucose and using this fat effectively, they produce something called ketone bodies, which actually suppress appetite even more. So that becomes a downward spiral for the ewe. So she's, her feed intake goes down, the liver's producing less glucose, she's running on fat, but this fat's clogging up her liver essentially, and the fetus becomes smaller. So we see this, that it can be, in most flocks, hopefully it's relatively uncommon. We can see outbreaks that are larger. Mortality can be very high if these aren't caught early. So you really need to prevent this because the mortality is pretty high. It's hard to treat. You can treat it, but it's not very effective. So we need to consider how to feed animals to avoid this. What we want to do is make sure of a couple things. We want to make sure we don't overfeed them early in pregnancy, which is one of the reasons why I talked about that early. And we don't, and what I've noticed is in my field experience is that fat ewes that are not exercising much, they too tend to have more problems. And then we need we need to make sure they're not too fat, but we also want to make sure that they've got adequate energy intake. So we want to make sure that they're having high digestibility in their diet, and we want to make sure that we minimize their stress. I see big ketosis outbreaks, for example, when ewes are fasted, like even for shearing. Say you're going to shear your sheep in late pregnancy, typically you hold them off feed for a day to make it easier to shear. Probably not a great idea for late pregnant ewes though, because it can throw them into ketosis because of the stress hormones. If you're out grazing, which you probably aren't too much in Quebec in winter, a winter storm can keep sheep away from their feed, stress them out, throw a lot of sheep into ketosis. So we want to increase their energy density, making sure that they're the right plane of nutrition, the right body condition. So in thin ewes, we want to make sure that they're well fed. Fat ewes, we want to keep them from, we don't want fat ewes entering late pregnancy. And we want to minimize their stress. So let me, for my last part of the talk about what I've seen in farms. Okay, so I teach some veterinary students as part of my responsibilities. I teach undergraduates, I teach veterinary students, and part of my veterinary student training is I take a group of veterinary students and I place them on various farms during lambing. So I have about 4 or 5 farms. I send 2 or 3 students there, and they do some case studies. So they were there, my students on these farms, and they were able to monitor the energy intake of ewes and then look at the incidence of ketosis. So they were able to take dietary samples. We had 8 different farms, but I'm only presenting 4 farms here that we looked at. All of these farms were prolific sheep that had 200% plus lamb crop. They're moderate size ewes, maybe a little bigger than your sheep, but pretty similar, 75 to 80 kilos. And they're mostly fed a silage-based diet. Okay, so we monitored intake. And this wasn't done, this is a field study, it wasn't done precisely, but we feel pretty good about the data that we collected. So what we have here is the energy intake of these 4 different farms. And then I'm also showing you here what the requirements are according to the NRC, or the National Research Council, the standard that we use for late pregnant ewes. You can see that these 2 farms, B and C, were feeding more energy. The animals were consuming more energy than needed. Yet the problem was both farms A and D weren't able to meet the requirements during late pregnancy. Interestingly, though, farms A and D differed. Farm D had a lot of really fat ewes, and farm A had a bunch of thin ewes. So these were different farms. And what we found is both of these farms had problems with ketosis. So the fat ewes from this farm predisposed them to ketosis because they weren't able to eat enough in late pregnancy. And in this case, these underfed animals also had the same problem, whereas the incidence of ketosis was extremely rare in these 2 farms. And these are pretty big farms, so they had almost no cases. So we looked at the energy concentration of the diets, and we found that even diets A and D were pretty good. Like the energy concentration wasn't bad. It was decent in these diets. but the intake of these animals was not as good. So it wasn't a matter of the density, it was a matter of the intake. So what would cause their intake to be different? Okay, so we looked at the starch content of the diet. It didn't really track. You know, one of these farms that had high intake had high starch, one of them that had low intake had high starch. So the starch didn't really seem to explain it. The amount of acid digestible fiber, which is the indigestible part of the forage, didn't seem to track too well with it either. However, the NDF concentration is something we want to look at. We found that this is the total fiber of the diet. We found, again, this wasn't too different between the animals, but what we did find is that the digestibility of that fiber was pretty different. So the animals were similar, the diets were similar in fiber, but not similar in fiber quality. Okay, so fiber quality was lower in both these farms, and that seemed to be the big thing that we saw. So we saw that the fiber quality was better in these. They had better quality silages. These two farms had lower quality silages. They both were feeding grain to supplement, but these had better fiber quality. So what we did for this farm, oops, let me back up. This particular farm here, we did an intervention. So we had this farm change the fiber quality of their silage, and we had them buy some new silage. Okay, so they were feeding some fairly poor quality silage that had a lot of corn stover in it. We call it husklage. And so their old silage, though, we got new silage for them. The energy content was the same. The NDF content wasn't too different, but the digestibility was pretty different. So the new silage had higher digestibility. The animals ate more. They ate close to 3%. Suddenly, because the quality of the fiber was greater, they could eat more. And that's the key here, okay? And then we saw a correspondingly big change in ketosis. So we pretty much removed the ketosis problem from these sheep. There were still a few cases because they still had a few obese sheep coming into the late pregnancy, which they shouldn't have. But we made a big impact by improving the fiber quality of the diet. So we changed the incidence quite a bit. And we, did this intervention. We replaced the poor quality silage with better silage. This did increase the cost of the diet. So when we made this intervention, we increased the cost 33%. So that was an investment you had to make. Was this investment worthwhile? So let's look at the income as a projection here, okay? So they had 400 ewes. They had 5.8% of them had ketosis. So that's a big loss of lambs, okay? At least 22 lambs. They lost 1% of these ewes died, okay? And so they lost some ewes. They saved some ewes and lambs. That has a pretty big monetary value. So the cost, and this is a conservative estimate, I would say for sure. So the feed differential was about $3,500. And so the benefit was, very positive. Plus the labor, which I didn't even account for in dealing with these sick sheep, is something that would be a, detriment as well, right? So that was gone. So, and everyone's happier. The sheep are happier, the farmer's happier. These are things that are hard to put sometimes a monetary value on, of course. Welfare was improved. And the lambs grew faster, which I didn't measure because these lambs were being fed better. They were bigger at birth. They were growing faster. That would have a value as well. And the lamb mortality, we didn't measure, but I'm sure it was, I'm not sure, but I would predict it could have been improved or better, lower lamb mortality with this better diet. And we also would predict that we might have better conception in the next breeding cycle as well. And improve welfare as I described. Okay, so that would be a big part of it. So to prevent pregnancy toxemia, ketosis, we want to make sure that we have adequate density of the diet, that we monitor intake so that we achieve this sort of 3% or high 2% range. We want to make sure that we do increase the starch content, but we don't want to increase it beyond a certain threshold. And that this energy content increase is going to come through not just starch, but with improved digestibility of the fiber component of the diet. We want to make sure that we don't put these ewes on a diet in late pregnancy. And we want to make sure that we try to avoid these feed fast cycles in late pregnancy, which could occur management-wise, like with shearing or maybe having sheep stuck in a winter storm. So let me summarize everything here as best I can with a few statements. So prolific ewes are going to require a high level of energy nutrition to support fetal growth and to prepare for a successful lactation. So providing this content will create challenges, however, in increasing this density while also maintaining this high level of intake. So that can be an issue. You want to maintain this high level of intake while increasing the density of energy so that the total intake is greater. This does require a combination of high quality forage and energy. And sometimes when you don't have access to high quality forages, a good strategy can be using a high energy non-forage fiber source, like some of the byproduct feeds I described, like soy hulls, wheat middlings, or beet pulp, which you may have access to, which are all used in the dairy industry, the dairy cow industry, pretty regularly. And again, ketosis is going to be minimized when you formulate a diet that allows for a high level of energy intake, and by managing ewes so that they're not overly fat when they enter early pregnancy. And the way to do this is basically, I find that farms that maybe do ultrasound, keep non-pregnant ewes out of the late pregnant group, because if you have ewes, for example, that don't get bred, and you feed them a late pregnancy ration, they're going to get very fat and they're going to be hard to rebreed. Or if you can get them rebred the next cycle, they're going to be more prone to ketosis because they're going to be too fat. So sometimes doing proper pregnancy detection early in pregnancy can be helpful too as a management tool in reducing this obesity problem, and simply culling ewes that are non-productive. So that's essentially what I have. I'd be very happy to entertain questions in English or French. We have an excellent group of interpreters here, or help from an interpreter to pose questions, and I'm glad to answer them.
So thank you, Richard. This was pretty informative. We've got two questions on the chat. So the first one was from Shelby. She's asking, is there such a thing as too rich forage bales or haylage for ewes?
Too rich?
Yeah.
Well, I would say for late pregnancy, probably not. Especially if you have sheep that are highly productive. If you're feeding ewes with twins or triplets, I would be reserving the higher quality forages for that period. And in terms of protein nutrition, though, maybe that's a consideration. Let's say, for example, you had two forages, one they're similar in energy, but one's a little higher in protein. I might use that slightly higher protein forage for early lactation, because as I showed you, the requirements for late pregnancy of protein are, they're not that high. So you want the high energy, but maybe the very highest, if you consider, I guess it depends what you mean by rich. If rich means high protein and the same energy, I might use that in lactation. But the main thing is, if you consider a rich forage to be one in energy, I would definitely want to use a high energy forage in late pregnancy.
Thank you. I think you answered it recently, but what are your thoughts on feeding sugar beet pellets to ewes?
Oh, yeah. So I guess sugar beet pellets, I'm assuming, are like the fiber component of sugar beets. Yeah, those are those can, I have not had experience feeding those. I just want to say that, because, so I don't want to speak too specifically about it, but I do know they're exactly the type of forage that I described. They're high energy source, but they're mostly high energy fiber. So those should be a good component to add to a diet if you need that. You know, if your silage quality is a little low, maybe you didn't get your hay silage, your grass silage harvested at the right time, maybe including some of that in the diet can be a good way to improve the fiber quality of the diet.
Okay, thank you. I don't see if you, I don't know if you see them, Richard, but another one was, yeah, you see them. So what's your thought on Span Brewery grain for sheep? Grain consists of wheat, oats, and barley, both crushed and whole. Both crushed and whole. Not sure.
Let me just,
yeah.
I'll see if I can see the question here. Okay, so the question was processing barley, whether that makes a difference or not, maybe. I don't see the question here, so.
Wait, he wrote it in French. Dans un cas où on aurait un fourrage plus pauvre en fin de gestation, est-ce que nous devons utiliser
in cases of poor forages?
In late lactation, is there a grain quantity we need to fill in the energy of the ewe?
Okay, yeah. I'll try to answer that. Well, let me guess about the barley question. Barley can be a great forage, and processing barley isn't necessary for most sheep diets, because the neat thing about a sheep is it can process the barley by chewing it, whereas cows can't. So generally you don't need to process barley. It won't make a big difference in its energy content. And then as far as the amount of grain to feed a sheep, I gave you some general guidelines there, but I can be more specific. Generally, we want to make sure that say the total intake of a sheep, let's say, you know, this 3% body weight, let's say you have, you know, an 80 kilo ewe and you want her to eat 2.4 kilos of dry matter. You don't want more than 40% of that 2.4 kilos to be grain. You know, you'd like to keep it lower. What I like to think about is you probably need about, you know, general rule of thumb that most farmers would have used without thinking too hard is that about a pound or 454 grams, right, of energy concentrate per lamb generally gets pretty close to the right amount of energy for late pregnancy. So I use that as a rule of thumb. That's not exactly what I end up doing, but that's a good general indicator. And that takes you pretty close to those target levels. Of course, when you have low quality forage, you might need to feed a little bit more or less, right? Depending on the forage quality. So hopefully I kind of answered some of that there. I see that Ginny asked, would it be better to feed the ewes the same forage during late gestation and early lactation to avoid feed stress, or can just consider that at nutrients would be okay? Yeah, that's a great question. You don't want to make major changes in forage content. If you do have high quality forage, keeping it the same is a good strategy. Let's say your forage inventory isn't adequate to maintain the same inventory over that whole period. I would tend to allocate blend in the forages that are higher in protein in early lactation. That's what I would tend to do. or simply just add a little more protein to the diet. Yeah, but you do need to consider the wholesale big changes in feed as a consideration. For most of our diets, I simply change the amount of protein in the diet by adding a little more protein supplement. I generally don't make big changes in forages when I don't have to.
Okay, thank you. It was my error for the question before, but
Okay.
the person write it in English, so it will be easy. In late pregnancy, if you have a low quality forage and then you have to put a very big quantity of grain, is there an option with monensin? Do you think using monensin would be an option?
Yeah, I hesitate on that. Monensin isn't going to make a big difference in safety there. I think what I would think, what most people would recommend, if you need to really increase your grain content, and let's say you're doing a component feeding strategy, right, where you're feeding grain separate from forage, I would definitely drop that grain into at least into 2 feedings per day. If you feel like, but I also think it's important to try to, if you can, find some better fiber source like soy hulls or beet pulp or something. So you don't want to get maybe more than 40% of that dietary dry matter intake as grain. You really don't. And I think if you have to get close to that 40% and that 40 to 50% range, you should try to split it into 2 feedings if you can. Or if you have a TMR, that's great. But for a component feeding system, it'd be better if you fed them twice a day.
Okay, thank you. Another one would be, have you ever studied on blood urea levels due to too much protein and embryo survival?
No. Yeah, I do. We do measure plasma urea nitrogen in our sheep samples. I have not seen too many negative consequences of really high protein diets. A good question, it's an interesting question. I don't have a good answer for you. I don't have strong evidence that there's a huge problem to feeding too high a protein, but basically, why do it, right? I mean, it's expensive. You'd rather reserve those high protein forages for lactation when they matter, because they'll matter a lot for milk synthesis when you have the higher protein.
Okay, thank you. Next one, what is your strategy when ewes show toxemia symptoms?
Yeah, that's a good question. So how do you treat it, right? Actually, I think I might have a slide on that. Let me see. I was anticipating this question. Let me see if I have one here. Is it there? Oh, yes. Magic. Okay. So yeah, if you don't mind me, I'll just use this slide to answer a question. So, again, this isn't answering it, but yeah, you don't want to treat this. You want to prevent it. So early detection. If you can detect it early, so again, if you see a ewe going off feed, not eating, and she's late pregnant, I think it's appropriate to just, as a matter of course, give them some propylene glycol right away, which is, propylene glycol basically has these 3 carbon units. The microbes can make glucose from it. So I give them a propylene glycol dose, usually about this much. And that would be what you'd want to do. If hopefully that ewe is going to respond if you catch it early. If the animal is later, and I'm not a veterinarian, so I got to be careful, what I recommend in terms of medications, right? So these are fairly standard protocols though. So I feel fairly safe in saying this, but glucocorticoid therapy can be useful. Basically, if you have an animal that's in bad shape, hopefully it's going to terminate the pregnancy, and that kind of solves the problem. The other thing about glucocorticoids, so glucocorticoids would be like dexamethasone. Dexamethasone is the most common glucocorticoid. What it'll do is if you have an animal that's in bad shape, and it's in full-blown ketosis, it might terminate the pregnancy, which you'll lose the lambs, but at least you'll save the ewe. Or what it can do is it will tend, if the ewe happens to be close to term, say in that last 5-6 days, it'll terminate her pregnancy, but it'll also have one helpful thing is that it helps mature the fetal lungs. So if you terminate a pregnancy a week early, one of the biggest challenges is those lambs don't have adequate lung maturation to survive. But giving dexamethasone will tend to hasten maturation of the lungs and help with that process. Plus, what it does, dexamethasone for the ewe helps her ewes create glucose from amino acids. So it's got some positive benefits. It could either terminate the pregnancy, which would solve the problem. It could help the lambs, if they're old enough, survive by increasing their lung development and create some glucose for the ewe. So my suggestions are to use propylene glycol if you can to get that ewe to pretty much eat anything. And then if it's a bad case, I would use glucocorticoid therapy because it's pretty much the only tool you have.
Okay. Another question regarding toxemia. We have heard that producers are using diabetic insulin measures like glucose monitors plus test strips to check for increasing probability levels of ketosis. Is this something you have heard or you recommend?
Yeah, so I think it's a reasonable, I don't know how predictive that's going to be actually. I think I usually use those keto strips, right? You usually use them in urine samples you collect. They can be very useful in telling you if the sheep has ketosis. Generally underfed ewes won't have that elevated of ketone levels, unfortunately, unless they're in ketosis. So it isn't that predictive of a problem. So it's more diagnostic, of the problem. So I would say it's pretty good in diagnosis, not so good in kind of predicting problems.
Okay. In the same order, I had a question regarding your field of research. How did you evaluate the ewes that were in ketosis?
Oh, how did I know they were in ketosis?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They can have other problems. We measured their urine. I didn't indicate that. We use keto sticks and plus other symptoms. Yeah, we did have some problems on other farms with milk fever, and that can be confused with ketosis, right? Sometimes you can have a complex, but these were clearly ketotic ewes based on ketone evaluation in urine.
Okay. Are the ketones level that indicate toxemia are the same as in cows?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They're the same ketones. The absolute levels, I can't, I don't have that figure in my head right now, what ketosis looks like. I should, but you basically measure beta hydroxybutyrate is the common ketone that's measured. It's a pretty more stable ketone, and it's a good indicator of ketosis.
Okay, and I had a question regarding butyric acid. We were wondering in your research field if you had measured the butyric acid in the forage of the farms showing more cases of toxemia.
Yeah, no, I didn't. These were, like I said, this was a pretty much a field study with veterinary students, and we didn't do detailed evaluations. But I would say I don't think butyric acid was an issue. It could be, though. Certainly, butyric acid can inhibit intake and cause problems. These forages were not very wet. Typically, we see high butyric acid levels in forages that are a little too wet. And, it has a pretty distinct smell. This was not a question. I do not believe, we didn't measure it.
Okay.
But my best guess is that I don't think it was a factor. I can't rule it out, but it didn't seem to be, these weren't the type of forages that would be high in butyrate.
Okay. Sorry, I'm looking at the same time at some questions. I have one right here. What about mineral recommendation in late gestation and early lactation? In dairy cows, to prevent ketosis in early lactation, we check the DCAD balance of the ration. So do you think it's something we should look on? We should check?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about that too. I think that there might be some reason. I mean, so the issue is probably preventing milk fever, right? So if you have problems on farms with milk fever, I would definitely look at the cation anion balance of those diets. I don't have great evidence that shows, from a scientific point of view, that those theories apply directly to sheep production, but I haven't really looked at it closely either. Stands to reason that they could. I do know that I have run into occasional problems with, it's kind of interesting, where people have fed, interestingly, way too much calcium in late pregnancy. So they think, feeding calcium sort of makes sense because you think, well, they have certain increases in calcium need. And so by increasing the calcium content of the diet, maybe you help milk synthesis, you make sure the ewe has plenty of calcium for the growing fetuses. And so a couple farmers would take, in sheep nutrition, usually you feed high calcium feeds to lambs that you're finishing, right? That you're going to sell to market. So you put some extra calcium in their diet to prevent urinary calculi. So these same farms took these same minerals that they use for growing lambs and they dumped them in the ewe ration. They're very high in calcium. And they started having a lot of problems with milk fever, which seems maybe counterintuitive because high calcium you would think would prevent milk fever. But what happens is, and I'm pretty sure this is true, is that I think having a high calcium in that late pregnancy feed sort of desensitizes that calcium mobilization cascade. So when the animal does give birth, it needs to produce all this milk, suddenly she doesn't have that capacity to mobilize her bone calcium because her blood was reading this high level. It's not going to be as sensitive to the normal signals. So I think feeding too high calcium, ironically, could be a problem. So you got to avoid feeding high calcium feeds in late pregnancy. Because when we remove this high calcium mineral, I can only say this, we remove this high calcium mineral from these diets of a couple of these farms I dealt with, their milk fever problem pretty much went away. So they do need calcium, but don't, like, sometimes farmers will often do this. They'll take, a little bit and think a lot more is better, and it can be the opposite. So with calcium, I'd say that's true. They need to meet their calcium requirements, but you don't want to give them so much that it depresses their ability to mobilize calcium when needed.
Okay, I understand. Okay. Sorry. We've got a few more questions, but now we're switching more to nutrition. Do you consider corn distillers to be good fiber source to supplement late gestation use, as the soy hulls are expensive and sometimes hard to get here in Ontario?
No, distillers isn't a very good source of fiber. I wouldn't think about it as a fiber source. In fact, it's not like a great fiber source. It tends to have some of its energy content comes from fat as well, which is fine. You kind of have to maybe be considerate of having too much fat in a diet. There's times where the only time I've seen problems with distillers is when people have bought like the syrup, they call it distiller syrup. And they try to mix that in a TMR, and they sometimes overdo it. They'll put like a whole lot of the syrup in a diet with poor quality forage, and then they run into problems. But I think distillers can be a good feed in moderation, but it's probably not going to substitute very well in terms of adding fiber quality to a diet.
Okay, and perfect. I think that answers well the questions. Do you have any special recommendations for primiparous ewes for preventing toxemia?
Okay, so ewes that
or having their first
lamb. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. As a special case, yeah, I guess, one of the challenges with sometimes with ewe lambs is obesity, right? Sometimes people will feed these ewe lambs a lot to get them to breed. And I think that might predispose them a little bit to ketosis. I guess I would, that's a tough one, right? Because you're trying to feed them a high energy diet to get them to breed. So I guess it's a matter of really watching maybe that energy intake after breeding. Maybe minimizing a little bit in late pregnancy might be a good idea. But I would caution against too much of that. As a matter of fact, but when I think about this question I'm not aware that that's a special problem in ewe lambs, ketosis. Generally is a little less of a problem, I would say, because they tend to have singles and fewer number of lambs. But if you are having a problem, and if you ask a question and suggest that you are, I would suggest that maybe I would just look at that energy, the obesity issue, and see if you can maybe moderate that energy intake after you get them bred, and make sure they're not overly fat.
Okay. We still have some questions.
Okay.
So in late pregnancy, you say energy requirements in ewe carrying triplet is roughly 235% of maintenance rations. My Romanovs typically are carrying quads and quins. How much more energy do you recommend for them?
Well, good for you. That's pretty great.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't have, I'd have to do some calculations, but yeah, proportionally more. But it's not an absolute, right? Because it's not going to be, I would say, at least 250, 260%. One could calculate that. But they're going to be smaller, but you're going to really need to have some high quality forages to eat them well. And I know you guys have, we do too, have some Romanov and maybe Finn genetics in your sheep that you'll have that reality. A lot of people don't have that as a quote unquote problem, but I would say, it's going to be probably at least 250% for quads, maybe 260%.
And should you add more energy too?
Well, it's the same issue, Okay. You want the energy content to be higher if you possibly can, but are you going to be able to meet that effectively? I just think you're just going to need to feed the best quality forages, and you're going to be pushing that energy concentrate up to probably close to 40% in some diets.
Sorry, I thought I was talking about protein. I mixed myself up, but you should.
Okay.
You should increase energy and protein if you're having quads or triplets, or quads or quins.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of late pregnancy rations for really prolific sheep, like you're talking about triplets and quads, I think I would get close to 15% protein. You're not going to cause any harm, and you want to make sure that you meet their needs. And you're probably going to make sure that mother doesn't lose too much protein from her muscle.
Okay. I think we have like 3 more questions. What do you think about corn silage for late gestation ewes? Is it better to add straw in the ration?
I think corn silage is great for late pregnant ewes as long as it's safe, right? Well, nice fermentation. I guess the question what the implication I'm guessing here is that does it have high enough dry matter content, right? And maybe that's what the concern is a little bit about adding straw. Corn silage is going to be most cases in the low 30s, right, in terms of dry matter content. And generally, that's enough dry matter to meet the requirements. So I'm not concerned about dry matter content issues too much. So I think I wouldn't add straw to their diet. Maybe, I mean, okay, it depends. Like for less productive sheep, maybe adding some straw could be a appropriate complement. But for the type of sheep we're talking about, I think the water content isn't a factor.
Okay. In the TMR, what is your recommendation about fiber length? What is too long and what is too short?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, what's the perfect fiber? We don't know that really well for sheep. I think that it can be a little shorter than cows. I think I would think about it in terms of quality and processing. I guess I have a hard time giving parameters on that. Certainly if it's, it can, I do know that it's less, like having too short of a chop is less of a problem in sheep production than it is in cattle perhaps. But I would think about it more in terms of maybe processing efficiency. I don't think having a super fine chop is going to make a real big improvement. So I guess I would kind of moderate that. Having a long chop, there's no, you can feed animals baleage that's not processed, right? I mean, they'll eat it. They'll just waste more. There's no big problem health-wise of doing that. It's just they're not going to utilize it very effectively. So I'd like to see it, less than 4 inches, I guess, if I could. Mm-hmm. But, getting it down to 1 inch probably isn't such a big deal. I guess I'd want it somewhere in that range of a couple inches would be kind of an ideal chop length, I would think. But again, I haven't really, that's a good question. We haven't really evaluated that. And if you know anyone who has, I'd be interested in hearing about it.
Well, it's an idea for a future project.
Exactly.
I think that will be our last one, maybe. Someone asked, I think you didn't mention the excess of degradable proteins in the rumen at the beginning of gestation and the possibility of being embryo toxic. What do you think?
Yeah, that's, you guys have some pretty great questions here. That's a great question. I don't have a great answer for it. I don't know. There is a literature that suggests in dairy cows that can be a problem. It's not an absolute clear-cut case. I'm not aware of, generally that's not an issue in sheep production because we're not feeding, it's more of an issue in dairy production, right? Because you're feeding cows high protein diets when you're trying to get them bred. In most sheep production systems, generally not such a big issue. Urea levels of the diets aren't that excessive. But I wouldn't suggest feeding a high protein diet because it's unnecessary for that period of time. Mm-hmm. I would suggest the main thing that you need to consider for that flushing period is just improving their energy, perception of energy by the brain. So if they have getting high energy, they'll ovulate more. High protein would be a waste of money and unnecessarily, but will it cause harm? I don't know. I'm guessing it's probably not a great strategy, but yeah, I can't say how much harm it would cause.
Okay. So we're arriving to the end of the question period. Thank you, Richard. I think you've had a lot of questions, and I think it shows that your presentation was interesting. and you were talking about a hot topic. I want to thank you for being here this morning. I also want to thank our translator, Pamela Cuisneau. She made this webinar possible for the French people speaking. I also want to thank all the participants for being with us this morning. It shows that you appreciate the project we're running. My colleague, Marie-Josée, will leave a small survey that you can answer in the chat box. You'll see on the right corner, you can select the language, so you can fill in the survey in English or in French. Lastly, we want to thank our financial support. So again, Innovation Agri-Food Program, since we all know that without their support, we would not have this opportunity this morning. So I will stop sharing your screen, Richard. And just a second. I want to invite you to our next webinar that will take place in fall. So the title will be The Success of Artificial Rearing of Lambs. It will be given by Laurent Sagot from l'Institut de l'Élevage. Take note that this webinar will be only offered in French. So I think this sums it up for me. I'm looking forward to see you next fall. Stay safe and have a nice day, everyone. So thank you.